So my name is Gerard. I got my Jerry, so please feel free to call me Jerry. And I hope you will answer lots of questions as well as me. I heard before that at least two of you from Baltimore, you and Baltimore. Whereabouts?
I grew up a block and a half from Denver racetrack.
Okay.
And then and then eventually I moved to Washington.
My daughter lives in that.
Yeah,
Okay.
still a very strong neighborhood.
I was born in John Hopkins.
Yeah.
You don't remember a thing.
So I'm going to stick to this outline, but before we start, I have a couple of other comments to make. Particularly the background of this time period in America. And we can generalize that it was more primitive than it is now. But I'm going to mention specifically how primitive it was. So what inventions didn't exist yet? Lots of them. The most important one was cannons. So when we look at the first slide, we'll see.
But don't forget to turn it back on.
You got to turn it back on. Okay, I've done this before. I just.
Slide it forward.
Here we go. So every illustration of this war was a drawing or a painting, which means that it's somewhat subjective. Right? I mean, that's fine, but I just want to make that point in the beginning in case there are any conflicts between what we hear and what we read, what we see. So this is the bombardment of Fort McKinley in 1814. And you can see the bombs bursting in air. I'm going to talk about them later on because they were an innovation for the British. And they were just incredible what they would do or could do to damage the enemy. So that's the first thing. No cameras. What else? No telegraph.
No internet.
No telegraph. And I was shocked to learn that the Battle of New Orleans, in which 2,000 British soldiers died, occurred 2 months after the peace treaty was approved. But they didn't know. They didn't know. It was approved at Ghent, by the negotiators. It wasn't formally adopted by the two countries until around Christmas time. But even so, that's a terrible thing. It resulted from the lack of certain things that we take for granted. So no cameras, no telegraph, no railroad. Think about all the founding fathers running up and down the East Coast by horseback trying to get the country together. Revolutionary war. No, this next one is kind of interesting. No public records or data that are really totally reliable. I mean, nobody had to collect. I mean, when we talk about the casualties of the battles or the number of men involved in the battle, there are conflicting numbers here. I mean, I've encountered 2 or 3 examples of that, so you kind of have to take that into account. But there was no totally accurate record keeping. The local newspapers were the best source of information, particularly in Baltimore, leading up to the battle and after the battle, and helping to circulate the popularity of the Star-Spangled Banner. We'll talk about that later. Also, American and British soldiers had different attitudes toward military tactics. The British, having fought over 10 years in the Napoleonic Wars, like the rest of Europe, they considered the formation, marching directly into the face of the enemy, to be what you had to do. And you're firing muskets at each other until a certain number of you are gone and the other side wins. That's what they did. That's what they believed. So they didn't believe in militias. And we'll hear a very good example of that. The commander of the British forces said, "Let it rain, militia." And they told him there were 20,000 of them waiting for him in Baltimore. He really didn't trust the military capability of the militia. So that's another thing to think about. And finally, the living conditions and the medical conditions were totally primitive compared to ours, which meant that in some cases more people died from illness or disease than were killed in battle. For what the total number of statistics tell us. So we're talking about things like smallpox, malaria, yellow fever, and cholera. Very, very common, and they took a tremendous toll on the populations of both countries as well as the rest of the world. In the 19th century, the first two cities in Europe to reach 1 million population were London and Paris. And they both had the same living condition problem, disposing of human waste. force increases the likelihood of the spread of disease. So kind of keep that in mind as we go through this and discover other facts about the war, that they were circumscribed by those living conditions. And I think that's pretty important. So we're going to talk, first of all, I'm going to go back one here. Well, no, we'll just stay with this for a while. We're going to talk about the causes of the war. And we can sum up the causes of the war in 4 words: fair trade and soldiers' rights, sailors' rights. Fair trade and sailors' rights. The United States had a good trading relationship with countries in Europe, and so that we were shipping goods over there after the revolution up until this time. But the British, when they got engaged with the French in the Napoleonic War, wanted to stop our trading, especially with France. So they would attack our ships on the high seas. They not only attacked them, they stole the sailors. And the term for that is impressment. I don't have that written down in here, but it's a key word. It's an unusual word. It's like impression, but it's not. Impressment. And I have the definition of impressment, which I think I have.
Shanghai.
Impressment was the enforcement of military or naval service on able-bodied but unwilling men through crude and violent methods. It had flourished into the early 19th century and in port towns throughout the world. So one figure that I came across, and I kind of think it's an awfully high figure, is that the British impressed as many as 6,000 American sailors in 3 or 4 years before we declared war on them. So that brought a lot of pressure on our president. This is an example of what they would do. The British would attack American ships and not only, prevent them from getting through to their goal of trading with a European country, but they would steal the sailors. So on the right is the British man of war, on the left is an American ship. Any questions about impressment?
The French had a navy. Was there anyone other than the British who would ever impress? I know the scale of it was very different, but
Yeah, I haven't come across any references to it. It's a good question. I don't know if the French would or not.
well,
Because we were trying to aid the French, actually, trade with the French. But that's a good question, and I don't know the answer. This is James Madison, who was the president at the beginning of the war. In the process of impressment, I'm going to sit down for a while. The British also freed some 4,000 slaves, and many of them joined the British war against the United States. So that's something else. But things got so bad with the impressment that finally in June of 1812, Madison sent a request to declare war to Congress. It passed pretty widely in the House. It was closer to the Senate, but it did pass. And so that's when the war begins. The declaration of war was June 18, 1812. At that point, it makes you wonder why we would do that, declare war against England after we already fought them, but especially because they had 600 cruisers in their navy. You know how many we had? About 16. 16 warships plus other small ones. So the British were going to blockade the whole east coast of the United States. So they sent almost 100 ships over here to do that. So I think I have a map. Yes, here we go. So they had the ships to blockade the whole east coast, from Canada all the way around Florida, which is not part of the United States, to New Orleans. And this kind of shows there were a number of the earliest battles were up around the Great Lakes, and I know very little, if anything, about them. But you can see which ones are labeled British and American victories on this map. And we're going to focus, obviously, let's see if I can use this. Right here, we're going to focus on this part. And we will end up with the Battle of New Orleans down here, which, as I already told you, occurred several months after the peace treaty was signed. Any questions before I go on? Any comments? Okay. The word again is impressment. It's a strange word. So the Napoleonic Wars lasted from 1803 until 1814. In April of 1814, that war ended, which meant that the British had a lot more ships and men to send over to the United States. One estimate I saw was they would have sent 20,000. Guess how many they actually sent? Maybe 5,000. But they landed in Maryland. They landed at what became the Battle of North Point outside of Baltimore. The man who brought them over was the head of the British forces here, General Ross. I learned a lot about him because he's very important in the Battle of North Point. So they had the world's largest navy. Most of them were involved in blockading the French. They sent about 85 vessels to America to help do this blockade. And again, we had only about 8 frigates and 14 smaller sloops. One reason that they wanted to target Baltimore was some of our ships were built in Fells Point. A number of them sailed out of Fells Point. The most famous of one was called a chasseur. I don't know French pronunciation, so I think I got that right.
Chasseur.
Yeah.
The hunter.
Is that what it means?
I believe so.
The hunter?
I hope.
Okay. Yeah. Now that particular ship didn't go over to Europe until early 1814. But when it did, the captain, who was a native, I believe, of Fells Point, issued a proclamation that he was blockading the entire English coast with his one ship, which caused a lot of people. Come on now, reaction by the British. But he ended up actually attacking like 17 ships. So he was kind of getting even for the impressive thing. And I'll mention him again later because I'm kind of going to
Sorry.
I have, in the section of related to sources, I have 2 books mentioned. I'm going to pass it around. You guys can look at it. This is what I got from a lot of information, and I think the 2 of the best sources. So please take the time to look at them and pass them around to the other tables. When we get to the end, I also have a binder that has information about where to go and visit these various sites in Baltimore, and I'll see that. Okay. So the United States had 4 frigates and a number of small ships. The British had as many as 85.
Just, sorry to go back a little bit, but given the fact the United States had such a small navy, and given the fact that the main cause of this was the British interrupting our trade, what was our goal? Our goal was to get the British to agree to stop interrupting our trade, or was it just a
I
reaction?
don't know what the wording of it, I know it was mostly to get even, to be impressive. Other than that, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. So in March of 1813, a British admiral named Cochrane, you'll hear his name many times, he arrives in the bay. That's the next slide. He arrives in the bay and he pretty much rules the Chesapeake Bay, Admiral Cochrane. He sailed up and down the bay. We'll talk a little bit. Anyone here from St. Michael's? No, but what is the story about St. Michael's in this war?
Fooling the British. Is that right? Fooling the British.
Yeah, the town that fooled the British
Yeah.
by hanging lights in the trees and so on to make them
Right.
think it was a bigger town than it was.
Yeah.
Do we know if that's true?
No.
No.
Yeah, it was first written in the 1890s.
Oh, really?
After, not in living memory of it.
Okay. Well, it may be true. I'm not saying it's not true, but I think we don't know for sure. So if it's true, he sailed up the bay because he wanted to attack these other towns. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. He wants to attack these towns up here. I have Havre de Grace on the map. Havre de Grace is the home of one of the commanders of the American Army, and he kind of wanted to get even. But also we have Elkton is up. I can't. I'm so sorry.
But it should be the bottom.
There we go. Elkton is up here. He stopped all the way along the way. He was doing 2 things. he was trying to discourage American soldiers. He was also trying to keep his men fed. So wherever he stopped, he would seal, would take whatever he needed in the way of supplies and food. So St. Michael's is listed here. If he was fooled on the way up, he definitely stopped there on the way back, because there is some evidence that he finally attacked St. Michael's and did some damage in the town. He went around on the miles from that and got in that way. I read an interesting fact about Tangier Island, that at one point there were 1,000 British troops there being trained. Which is kind of interesting. So he had enough force with his ships and his men to do whatever he wanted. On the way up the bay, he also did a little bit of reconnaissance on Baltimore. And again, Baltimore was called a haven of pirates because of something called privateers. Another very important word. Anybody know what it means?
It's a
Okay,
licensed pirate.
She just said, it's pot. I would hire someone's government to be a pot. I worked against enemy nation.
Right. So the government would kind of authorize them to act for the United States because the United States didn't have a big enough navy. So a number of them were based or built in Fells Point, which is another reason the British wanted to attack Baltimore.
Wasn't Poplar Island also a place where the British were camped out?
Quite possibly.
It's one of the things they say at Poplar Island. Now I have no idea.
That's probably true of a lot of places up and down there.
Yeah, right. Why not?
So again, it's a question of who kept the records and how do we know what is totally accurate? But there are lots of examples of that up and down the bay. I think there are a couple on here that I didn't mention. The Battle of Slippery Hill in Queenstown, Battle of Coxfield, 1814. But his biggest desire, Admiral Cockburn's biggest desire was to attack Washington. And then secondly, he wanted to attack Baltimore. So that's what we're kind of leading up here. So we're getting close to when they actually land, but not quite yet. Havre de Grace, they really leveled Havre de Grace. Sorry, I have a lot of notes here because I don't want to forget anything. I think that's about it. Oh, I know. When the Chasseur finally did reach the British waters, which was later in 1814, this was his proclamation. I do therefore, by virtue of the power and authority in me vested, declare all the ports, harbors, bays, creeks, rivers, inlets, and outlets and seacoast of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in a state of strict and rigorous blockade. In fact, he did attack and had victory over 27 small ships. So it wasn't a fake, fake. But people were appalled. How can one ship blockade the entire coast? But he was pretty good at it. And when he came back later in 1814, his ship was renamed. I have some slides.
Yeah, it was sort of an opening, yeah.
The Pride of Baltimore was built up in the 20th century, and then it had a disaster at sea,
Yeah.
and now we have the Pride of Baltimore too. And I have slides of those, which I'll show you.
Okay.
Okay. So Fells Point was one target that Admiral Cockburn wanted to attack, which was his reason for attacking Baltimore after he attacked Washington. But now we're going to talk about the attack on Washington. Get my notes straight. Sorry. I have too many notes. So in April of 1814, I think this is the next slide, they were going to go up through two routes to attack Washington. Right? One is to go up the Patuxent River from the bay here, and the other is to go up the Potomac River here. So when Major General Ross brought over his 4,000 to 5,000 men in the spring of 1814, they went up, they took both routes, and they headed to Bladensburg, which is up here. Bladensburg is now a suburb of Washington. It's northeast of the city, as you can see here. I'm not sure why that was the battleground. On the way up the river, up the Potomac River, they passed Alexandria, which took one look at the British ships and surrendered. They didn't want to be attacked. So the battle of the attack on Washington, which I'm going to talk about next. I'm sorry, I'm missing something in my notes. It's really hard to do it without something. I can talk about it. The attack on Washington centered around the meeting of the American and British forces in Bladensburg. And the American commander there was totally inept. He had been appointed not by Madison, but by, I think, the Secretary of War. And all the troops there were militia. And he had no idea how to move them around and get them to defend Bladensburg. So the Battle of Bladensburg on August the 24th was won by the British. And from there, General Ross's and Admiral Cochrane's goal was to march into Washington and destroy as much as they could. Just kind of shocking, but that was their goal. This is the Battle of Bladensburg, and you can see Washington over here is a little bit away from the battle. And the population of Washington at that time was about 60,000, plus 20,000 slaves. Washington was a center of auctioning off slaves, even at this date, within a few blocks of the capital. It was also, as we still know today, in the summertime, it's very, very hot. It was full of mosquitoes, and obviously it helped contribute to the spread of disease among the soldier casualties of the battle. So the British won the Battle of Bladensburg and then proceeded into Washington. And once again, we're relying very heavily here on paintings to burn the Capitol. At that point, the Capitol did not have a dome. The dome was not added until the 1850s. I was shocked just recently if you go online, we're so different than the people at that time. We have access to incredible information, but it's not always accurate. I Googled about the burning of Washington, and I got a picture of the Capitol with the dome on it being burned. That did not happen.
Well, initially there was a smaller dome.
Well, I'm going to show you the painting that doesn't indicate that. Well, I'm not going to say yes or no. So they burned the Capitol building. And this is the picture. See, there is no dome here.
It isn't finished.
There is no dome here. The Capitol, let me back up a little bit. There was an architect who came here from England who helped design the Capitol. There were 3 different architects because it took so long to build the Capitol. And the one that I'm thinking of also designed a church in Baltimore, which I'll show you in a minute. Can't remember his name.
Latrobe. Benjamin Latrobe.
Benjamin Latrobe, thank you so much. Benjamin Latrobe was the first professional architect to practice in the United States. And he helped design the Capitol. He helped supervise part of the construction. As you can see here, there were only 2 wings on the Capitol at that point. I think the House met in one and the Senate met in another. But somewhere in there, the Supreme Court met also. They all met there because that's all that the Capitol consists of. And it is made out of white marble. So Benjamin Latrobe designed that. If you're familiar with Baltimore, which some of you are, so this is the dome that went up in the 1850s. And they used a lot of steel and iron in the construction of the dome, as well as marble. Benjamin Latrobe designed this building, the Basilica of the Assumption in downtown Baltimore. Both of them are in the style of we call neoclassical. And you probably noticed in my resume that my area of concentration was in art and humanities. So I studied a lot about architecture. I think it's really good that the style was neoclassical, because the other popular style at the time was Baroque. I can't imagine are several buildings in Washington in a Baroque style, which was heavily tied to the rich people of Europe in those centuries. So Benjamin Latrobe did this, and then they went and burned the White House. Now, I didn't mention that at the Battle of Bladensburg, I did mention that the American commander was totally inept. So he couldn't decide on how to distribute the militia and defend Bladensburg. There was a bridge crossing over the river there that they had to defend. So President Madison actually rode out to Bladensburg to watch the victory. And as soon as he showed up, he said, go back, we're losing, you know, they were panicking, they were retreating. So he left in a panic. And his wife rescued him. I guess he told his wife, we don't know for sure. But she rescued a famous painting of George Washington from the White House and took it with her. So this is the burning of the White House. There's a certain myth about the White House. Who's it called the White House? Because they painted it white to cover up the burn marks? No, not really. And I know about this because part of my background is in architecture history. It was made out of sandstone, not marble, and the sandstone was painted white. So they just put another layer of sandstone and another layer of white paint. It was white to begin with, and it's still white. But there have been major rebuildings of the White House.
So it burned down completely?
It was gutted. The interior burned, as you can see here. There's several, this is pretty accurate. There are numerous paintings of the Capitol building being burned and the White House being burned. They also burned the Treasury building. They burned the Navy Yard. They really did. They could have destroyed the whole town if they wanted to. So that was an interesting and factual thing to see that they attacked Washington. And then Admiral Cochrane persuaded Major General Ross to attack Baltimore. So, any questions yet?
Now, is it still sandstone?
Sorry?
Is it still sandstone or is it?
That's a good question because it has been totally rebuilt several times in the 20th century. Good question.
So
I should know the answer to that.
they burned all those buildings, but they did not occupy Washington.
No, the occupation of Washington lasted 26 hours.
They didn't have enough people to do it, right? Or didn't have enough,
I'm sorry.
didn't have enough resources to.
Well,
occupy.
I think they got carried away. I don't know if they intended to set fire to those buildings when they first attacked. But it was so easy, victory was so easy that they just did that. But there was nothing else to do there. Because it was a small, evolving capital. So I think attacking the Navy Yard was probably the other major idea they had in mind. Was the war. So then the big question was, will they attack Baltimore? Which the British hated even more than Washington as a symbol of resistance and so on. So before I get to that question, preparing for the attack on Baltimore, I have some information about Francis Scott Key. So I'm moving toward the end of the outline that I gave you and talking about the life of Francis Scott Key. Because I didn't know this when I started researching this. He was present at the Battle of Bladensburg. He was a member of the militia from Georgetown. So he was born in 1779. His father and his uncle were both lawyers. When he was old enough to go to college, they sent him to St. John's College in Annapolis, which is where he met his future wife. His wife was Mary Lloyd. Does that name you anything? Wyeth, the Wyeth Plantation. They owned the Wyeth Plantation, which had 10,000 acres and 300 slaves. Yeah.
Where was that?
It's where the Wyeth Center is today in Talbot County.
7 miles from the neck.
I've never been there, but I know people who have been. And they had the history of the musket, and they have, what is the grain thing?
With what?
A grain processing.
Yeah.
But I didn't know before that it had 10,000 acres
Well, there's a grist mill up at Y Mills, but that's not part of Y Plantation.
Well, there is still a house there, isn't there?
Oh, Y House is there too.
We were just there at Hickory Creek at a event there, and there was no grist mill.
No, that's up at Y Mills.
That's what I'm talking about, wine mills.
Oh, okay.
There's
Not
a lot
Y,
of wine plantation in the old days.
that's, no,
No, okay.
that's separate.
Oh, okay, well, thank you, I've never been here. I know people
Yeah.
have been there.
I live right around the corner.
Oh, good. Okay. So he attended St. John's College in Annapolis, and he was admitted to the bar in Frederick County around 1800. He married Mary Lloyd in 1802. And then in 1806, he was a successful country lawyer, like his father, but he wanted more, so he decided to move to Georgetown. So the family moved to Georgetown in 1806. They lived there for 30 years, which I never knew. That's why he joined the Georgetown militia. And was present at the Battle of Bladensburg, but I don't think he actually saw action. So I think I mentioned before the population of Washington, did I say 60,000 and 6,000? With 2,000 slaves. So slave sales were common in DC at the time, even along Pennsylvania Avenue near the new Capitol. He was influenced by his uncle, who was also a lawyer, and he took over his uncle's practice in DC. So he really was successful in Georgetown as well. He lived on M Street in Georgetown. The house, the family house, was where his business was centered, his legal business was centered. So he was pretty successful in Washington, and that's why he gets involved in something. Well, let me mention something else. He argued before the Supreme Court at the Capitol building, what we just saw. And he argued both sides of the slavery issue. He argued in one case to free a slave, and he argued in another case to retain the ownership of the slave. So his attitude towards slavery is pretty ambivalent at this time, which I wasn't aware of either. He defended individuals, and he believed that the law of nature, all men are free. So that's contradictory, right? So we need to know that about his background. I read somewhere that he owned slaves. At the time of his death, he owned about 8 slaves, which he kept in Frederick to take care of the family estate where his mother still lived. And he was a member of the local Episcopal Church. He also was friends with Roger Taney. Anybody know who Roger Taney is?
Supreme Court Justice, Dred Scott decision.
Yeah, the Dred Scott decision. So again, he had ambivalent feelings about slavery. So I guess we're ready to talk about the attack on Washington. But there's one other important thing about Francis Scott Key here. After the Battle of Bladensburg, there was a local doctor named William Beanes who arrested 4 British troops after the burning of Washington because he thought they were stealing. So he in turn was arrested by General Ross, head of the British Army. So this Dr. Beanes was taken into custody and put on a British ship. So Francis Scott Key was asked to negotiate to free this doctor from being a British prisoner. So what Francis Scott Key did, and I might go back here. Can I turn it off? No. It's not working.
No, I just bumped my mouse. It might have been it. You want to go back?
Yeah, go back one.
Okay, now try. See if it'll work for you.
Well, never mind.
It might have
I
gone to
just want to make
sleep.
sure I can't go forward either.
Turn it off and back on again.
Yeah,
It unfortunately goes to sleep too soon, and I can't change
There we
it.
go.
There you go.
okay. This is not the slide I thought I was going to get, I'm sorry. So he decided to, Francis Scott Key got the help of another negotiator, and he sailed out of Baltimore. And he sailed down the bay and up Potomac River to meet the general in charge of the British forces. And And the general refused to release Dr. Deans because he said, you know, he was a traitor. He was doing things against the British government. But during this whole negotiation process, General Ross was afraid that Francis Scott Key had picked up information about the planned attack on Baltimore. So he wouldn't let Francis Scott Key go free. He transferred him to a British ship and moved that down to the mouth of the bay, of the Potomac River. That's why Francis Scott Key ended up being in a position to see the flag flying over Henry. He was still a prisoner, having tried to negotiate the freedom of this position with the British. So he was kept a prisoner on a separate ship between 6 and 7 miles south of Fort McHenry. Even I have doubts if he could have seen the flag that far, but we'll talk more about that, because the size of the flag was immense. Okay. I think it's interesting that the British commanders and British officials would sit down and have dinner or lunch with their enemies. But that was very common, you know. Your social thing is separate from your government military thing. So General Ross was very cordial about having a meal with Francis Scott Key, but he was still afraid that Key would pick up that they were going to invade. So he imprisoned him on the ship. Okay, if you look closely here at this shot, Fort McHenry is right here. This is what is now the Inner Harbor. I'm going to talk later about Federal Hill, which is located here. This is where the point was located. And up right over here is where the British Army wanted to come in and attack the city. So the plan was to attack Baltimore by land and by sea. So the ships came up, and we'll see it on the map that shows that. The ships wanted to get all the way up to Fells Point, where they could then bombard the American defenses to the north of Fells Point. But I want to talk about the fort here for a minute. What's the shape of that fort?
Star shaped.
A star shape. You know where that comes? Star shape. Do you know where that comes from?
No.
It goes all the way back to the 15th century in Europe. It was very common to build forts in the shape of a star.
Defend from all directions.
Exactly, defend you from all directions. So that's, it did away with areas in which the attackers could get through. So that was very, very popular. I didn't know until I started doing this research that there are a number of them in the United States. So in the research section at the back, sources, you'll see starforts.com. And if you go to that website, you'll see that not just Fort McHenry, which was built between 1798 and 1803, but Liberty Island, New York Harbor, Governor's Island, New York Harbor. There's one in Boston, there's one in Hampton Roads, there's one in Newport. Star-shaped forts. So we're going to talk about what was good and bad about that when we talk about the attack on the city of Baltimore. Okay. This is a view of what Baltimore looked like around the turn of the 1800s. And this is from Federal Hill. So that's why Federal Hill was an important site. There was an observation tower there that could alert the city to attacks coming by water. And that's one of the sites that you can actually visit later on. I mentioned the chasseur. This is a painting of what the chasseur looked like. They look shallow, but they're not. They actually had cargo beneath that shallow top. And this is the pride of Baltimore today. There have been two of them. One of them was lost at sea. It still sails around the world or around the country to publicize the port and the history of the port. And if you're lucky, you can find it in Baltimore. Sometimes it's docked in a canal. So the man who was in charge, the city realized that they might be attacked by the British. They put him in charge of defenses. Now, there is one story that when Washington was burning, You could see it all the way 38 miles away from Baltimore. The sky was lit up. So that kind of panicked people into getting the defenses together pretty quickly, which is what they put General Sam Smith in charge of.
Excuse me, is this a federal defense, or was it the city of
It's a
Baltimore?
local, it's a local
City of
defense.
Baltimore police or whatever, or.
Well, militia.
Militia.
Militia, yeah, good point. There was a committee of public safety, which erected defenses on the east side of the city. So
Okay.
Sam Smith figured out that they were likely to land over here, which is called North Point, which is what they did, and march up here toward the city on the east. It's about 10 miles. So they decided to defend here, which is Hampstead Heath. And this actually shows us the whole unfolding of the sequence of the battle. Here are the British ships who decided to bombard Fort McHenry, which is right here. And all of this takes place within 2 days. The first day, they land at North Point, they march toward the city, and there's a battle of North Point. Sam Smith sent one of his colonels out with a force of several thousand troops to stop the British carry. So this is called the Battle of North Point. And it was at the Battle of North Point, well, before the Battle of North Point, let me go back. General Ross, see here, he was the head of the British Army. And he wanted to be in the front. He wanted to see how weak the American militia was and how successful the British professional army was. So after he had breakfast at a local farmhouse, and they warned him, there are 20,000 militia waiting for you in Baltimore, in Hampstead Heath. And he said, I don't care if it rains militia. So he goes out with his advanced troops, and he is shot and killed by a sniper. Now, snipers were considered cowards by the British Army. We don't hide in trees. You know, we march face to face, firing our musket at each other until you're killed, or you give up and you run away. So this was a double kind of curse on General Ross. He was hit by a musket that entered his lung. He died within minutes or hours at the most. Now, his replacement was a Colonel Brooke, who was far less experienced than he was. So, but Colonel Brooke went ahead, and they had a skirmish here called the Battle of North Point. And I was trying to find a record of how many the casualties were. So General Smith sent 3,000 men. That's a pretty good number. About the advance of the British. And they fought. British forces eventually learned that they're going to be outnumbered if they go all the way to Hampstead Hills. But after this battle, they go up here and they camp overnight. A couple of things are going on here. They're fighting the weather. It rained for 2 days. British troops are wearing wool outfits in August.
Yeah.
You can imagine what that's like. So they get up here and they camp overnight, and Brooke has a big decision to make. He's waiting for the ships to get past Fort McHenry. He finally gets word the next day that they can't because they have sunk ships here. There are sunk ships right here. I think the next map will show that, but I like this map a lot better. The Americans sunk ships right off the fort to stop the British ships from getting through.
Yeah, he said that the militia met him at North Point, but then the British camped up the top there. So the militia must have retreated.
Yes, they did. Good point.
Okay.
They did.
Supposedly they won that battle.
Well, there weren't that many casualties. I think the Americans conceded that they won the battle, but they succeeded in slowing them down so that the rest of the preparations up here could be completed. They had like a 2-mile earthworks defense thing that they were building because they were absolutely certain that this is where the British were going to come in. And they would have come in if they had succeeded in getting past Fort McHenry, because the plan, again, by land and by sea, is the ships will come up here to Fells Point and fire. They would fire at the back of the American defenses. From Fells Point, it's only like a mile. From Fells Point up to where Hampstead Heath is. And Hampstead Heath is where the earthworks were, that the Americans were doing. Okay. One more little thing. So it rained all night when they disembarked. It rained the next day. It got hot. The British forces were getting discouraged. They won this little skirmish up here. It's more than a skirmish. It's called the Battle of North Point. So let's go on to the next slide. This is a painting, an artist's impression of the Battle of North Point. Can you tell the British from the Americans? The British were being red, right? But other than that, this looks like too organized a battle to me for the Americans to do, the American militia to get involved in. So there are lots of these illustrations out there from the time period because, again, they had mechanics and there was a way to know what happened. But it was a battle. It was a battle. Okay. This is General Ross after he was struck by the sniper bullet. Now, not all the history books say he was killed by a sniper. The people who lived in North Point did. In fact, they have the names of the 3 snipers that they credit with killing this general. And they have a little monument to him. And now we're ready for the battle of Fort McHenry, the bombardment of Fort McHenry. You can see it really is a stark fort. Anybody ever been there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Lots of times I've been. Yeah, well, so let me get the rest of my notes here. So at 6, well, what happened overnight was the British camped out after the Battle of North Point. They came within 3 or 4 miles of the defense earthworks at Hampstead Heath. And they camped overnight, and Colonel Brooke is trying to decide should he attack or not. And he finally gets word, number 1, that there are as many, at least 10,000 troops, maybe 15, and he could be outnumbered by 3 to 1. He's not as experienced as General Ross was in shooting. And then finally he gets word from the ships that they can't get past the fort. That they would not be able to support his attacking Hampstead Heath by firing from the ships to the rear of the American defenses. So he decides to leave. So he gets his men to march back down, get on the ships, and leave. So that's why the Battle of Baltimore never happened at Hampstead Heath. There was the Battle of North Point, then there's the bombardment of Fort McHenry. So we're going to talk about Fort McHenry next. So on September the 13th, at 6:30 a.m., the first of an estimated 1,800 cast iron bombs are hurled at the fort. 1,800. I think General Armistead is the man in charge of the fort. And if you go there today, there's a statue of him. And I suspect he's the one that kept track of how many bombs were being fired. 1,800 cast iron bombs. They were firing a new bomb called a Congreve rocket. The Congreve rocket was fired 1,000 feet into the air toward the enemy, and it exploded 1,000 feet and cast shrapnel on the enemy. The only problem was they couldn't aim it very accurately. So they're firing that many because they're not all going to burst over the fort. There were about 1,000 men at the fort under General Armistead. I don't know where they all were, because if you've been to the fort, I'm going to show you well, I can show you here. Oh, there we go. These are the barracks. These are the barracks. This is like the officers' quarters. This is the ammunition storage place. But there are lots of tunnels here, as we'll see. This is the main entrance to the fort. This is the top of the ramparts. So there's earthenworks with brick walls are called ramparts. They make up the star shape of the fort. But I don't know where they put it. Well, there are lots of tunnels under the ramparts. I guess that's where the men were hiding. Because there weren't that many, this is General Armistead, there weren't that many casualties in the fort of this bombardment. Yes?
It's my understanding that that entire peninsula, if you sort of zoom out a little bit, was the fortification. The fort itself was like, in effect, the inner works into which, in the dire circumstances, everybody would have fled. But there were a lot of batteries and so forth, well outside, 100 yards or so.
I know for a fact there were other forts nearby in that peninsula.
Well, Lazaretto Point is its sister across the entry to the inner harbor.
Which
And
is,
I know there were batteries over there, but I don't think it was like 1,000 people were in the fort.
well, that's a good explanation. That is, does seem kind of hard to believe. So you're saying that in the surrounding area. General Armistead was the only person who realized that this ammunition warehouse was hit by one of the bombs. The bombs pierced the roof, it didn't explode. So immediately afterwards, he said, take all the ammunition out, and take it outside the fort to the back. So that could have been a disaster right there if that had gone on. There's a lake north of the city called Lake Roland. No, anybody ever been there? Yeah, that was a reservoir. Yeah. But there's a plaque there somewhere, because I've been there and read it, that said there used to be a munitions manufacturing plant there. And there's a record that they shipped 200 barrels of gunpowder to Fort McHenry to prepare for this battle. So he acted quickly enough to save them. But that makes a lot of sense that that the other fortifications in the area would accommodate themselves. And this is the flag that flew over the fort. The Francis Scott Key saw from 6 or 7 miles away. Anybody know the size of this flag? Oh, good. I like this comparison. It's 30 by 42 feet. It took them 6 weeks to make it. And Armistead, before the battle, months before the battle, before the attack, he got this woman named Mary Pickersgill to build this huge flag that he could fly over the fort. 30 by 42 feet. Her house is right here, what's right here. You can still go there. It's called the Flag House in Baltimore. It's where they made this flag. They made another flag, a smaller one, that they could fly in a storm. So it wouldn't be ripped apart. So there was a storm flag, and then there was the big flag. So this is, I think, another view. Yeah, it is another view of the bombardment of the fort. And again, you can see the bombs bursting in air, some of which fell inside the fort, but not too many of them. It's aiming at us.
They knew they weren't gonna be able to get into the harbor, but they still bombed, right?
Yes.
So that was like a.
That's a good point, too. Well, I don't know if they knew, because they kept going closer to the fort, and then once they came within range of the fort's guns, they would back home. They did that several times. And I guess perhaps, we don't know, in the process of doing that, they saw the ships that were sunk. Because they did, yeah, that's a very good point. How did they know they couldn't get through? Because Colonel Brooke, who's the guy waiting after the Battle of North Point to find out if they're going to get through, he didn't get any word until the next day.
They bombed not knowing, they thought they could get through.
They thought they would get through.
But
But maybe at some point during the bombing, as they moved back and forth,
they realized it.
they realized that there were ships sunk in the thing. See how much information we don't have. It's not recorded. Okay, any questions about this? You can't tell from this one that it was a Starport thing. Not at all.
Did they sink any ships? Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry?
Did they sink any ships?
Did the British sink any ships?
No. Did,
The Americans? No.
no.
Every time that the British fleet got closer to doing a heavier damage, they were within, and there is a record that happened several times, I think in the British record.
So those ships are an anchor, they're just sitting there, they didn't get them out of the way or anything?
Well, they're out of range, I guess. You can see here things exploding in front of them.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah. And if we went back, way back, I'm sorry. This is my favorite map. I'm sorry, here we go. You can see the directions here. They would go up, and then they would come back. See that? So they start off bombarding here, then they get closer, and then they come back. But it was a very clever plan to attack by land and by sea. And if General Ross hadn't been killed, And if they succeeded in bombarding the fort, the city would have fallen for sure. I'm sorry, let me go back quickly. So that's the flag. This is the final view of the bombardment of the fort. And you get the bombs bursting in air. Francis Scott Key recorded so. And here he is. And there's the flag, way over there. I don't know how I can see it from 6 or 7 miles away.
Spyglass.
Spyglass.
Poetic license. Poetic license.
Poetic license. There's a lot of poetic licenses to record on this whole thing. Okay, now, this is a map of Baltimore today with all of that information superimposed. So if you're interested in visiting any of these sites, there are a number of other interesting things going on here. This is where the Francis Scott Key Bridge fell in the spring of this year. It was part of the Baltimore Beltway. They named it the Francis Scott Key Bridge. But what they've superimposed on this map is the battlefields. So if you're interested in visiting these places, that's how you do it. This is North Point down here, where they landed. And then they marched north this way. I don't know where the Battle of North Point is. I don't think it was this far away. I think it's farther up here.
It's right there.
Does it say?
I'm sorry, I think it was in the vicinity of where you had where the B is in back. You know, the back river.
Oh, here.
I think it was in that.
In that vicinity. And there is a small monument there, which I'll show you a picture of. A very small monument. It's probably the least visited site of the whole situation. But up here is where Brooke stopped. So it's about a 10-mile march this way. The Philadelphia Road is Route 40, comes down this way. And that's where he camped for the night. You can see how extensive the fortifications were in Hampstead Hill, Hampstead Heath. And this is where the British would have fired into the back of the American defenses. Any questions about this one? There's some interesting little cannon up here, which I have no reference to. Let me back up a little bit here. So if you want to go to Federal Hill is right here. It overlooks near Harlem. It was a key defense in the Civil War. It was occupied by a whole garrison of federal troops because there were so many Southern sympathizers in Baltimore. So literally, there was cannon. I'll show you a picture. The cannons aimed into the city, and there were several people who were executed for questioning, the North.
So it wasn't called Federal Hill in 1812, right? It must have been called
Yeah, it
something.
was. It's been called Federal Hill since its founding because there was a big celebration there when the Constitution was approved. So it goes way back. And there's a statue there today of General Sam Smith. And a cannon from the Civil War. So those are the sites that I would recommend visiting. Federal Hill, Hampstead Heath, and I'll show you a couple of other ones. This is the battle monument that was erected in the 19th century to commemorate the Battle of Baltimore. And that is not a particular person on top, it's a goddess of victory holding up a crown of victory. It's right behind the courthouse on Calvin Street. This is Hampstead Heath today. It looks nothing like it would have looked then. But those cannon do date from the period. Hampstead Heath is part of Patterson Park. You ever designed Patterson Park? What's your name? The Olmsted Brothers. Oh, you're familiar with Central Park. The Olmsted Brothers came in at the end of the 19th century and designed a park. And by then they had added like 50 more acres to the whole park. So it's a very interesting place to visit, and I'll show you my favorite spot.
Well, it's interesting to see the battlements and everything. The wars just seem so stupid because they're going to be able to occupy and own this country. Those battles.
No, they weren't. You're right.
All right, and our fortification was a combination to protect a country that finally was trying to get united. And how could they even find enough men to impress because we had so few ships to take men off of? So were they just so pissed off with
Well, I
that?
question that 6,000 figure of impressments.
Well, 6,000, but the 6,000 people were on boats or were they on the land? How were they impressing?
Well, they were impressed.
Also, they were the crew, they were the sailing crew of the ship.
Commercial boats, we must have had.
Okay, fine, so these are not battleships, these are,
No.
ships of
I think you're saying.
And they were taking battleships, 20 to 2.
American
These are like the
commercial
pirates
ships,
of
and
the
the people
right.
off the commercial ships, right? And we had tons of commercial ships. We were
Okay, so
big.
that's what we're protecting, that's what we're so angry about. And they're just trying to interrupt the trade, take the sailors on, do they rob the bounty of the commercial ships?
In some cases, they did, yeah.
But that wasn't the goal was just to disrupt this young nation's trade.
Exactly. So that France couldn't get more goods from the United States.
And so by doing that, come in, get the seat of government, get the places of where the ships are, just be disruptors.
And there were two parties in Washington, the Republicans and the Federalists.
Yeah.
The Federalists were opposed to the war. Francis Scott Key was originally opposed to the war.
Because they felt what?
I
If they
don't
were
know what
opposed to the war, then what?
Well, because
That?
Great Britain had a navy of 600 ships. How could we possibly deal with that?
So we were gonna give up again? We were gonna surrender?
I don't know. Good point.
I think, two observations. I think it's the case that we think of the War of 1812, it isn't a footnote in European and British history. I mean,
Yeah, right, exactly.
This was nothing. It was at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, everything, I mean,
It was
nobody.
a minor tag at the end of the
I
Napoleonic
don't know
War.
anything about that. There was a thing we call War of 1812.
It's called the Forgotten American War.
The other thing has to do with economics, because, we're talking about the commercial shipping of the US and so forth. Our country was in a terrific boom period during the 1790s, early 1800s into 1820 because of the Napoleonic Wars and the disruption of everything agriculturally in Europe. So we were making hay while the sunshine shone. And then, which was why that commercial activity was so strong. I mean, it was unrealistically strong.
Were we also fighting the Indians? And what else was going on?
Well, yeah, there were the French and Indian
Standing
War.
west, were we-
Yeah, council, that before we get 12,
Or it was who?
council.
Tecumseh, yeah, yes.
Well, the British had arranged alliances with the Indians as a subplot in that war.
And there were a lot of objections to this war, including Francis Scott Key. He originally objected to it.
And you didn't talk about the rigging on the ships, the difference in the ships between the British and the Americans, and that had a lot to do with the,
Oh, yeah, the British had man of war. A man of war.
they had a man of war. It was a big bluff bow, big heavy thing with square rig, which takes a lot of sailors to handle, which was part of the issue. Whereas the Americans in Fells Point and in St. Michael's, a great many of them in St. Michael's, were building clipper ships, which was a whole new concept, sleek, not the big bluff bows, carried a lot less cargo, that could do it a lot faster, and was fore and aft rigged. Now, a lot of you are sailors, I'm sure, and you know how to handle a fore and aft rig, and you know how to tack. And you come across with the wind across the bow. Can't do that with a square rigger. Or
That's why the Chasseur or Crown of Baltimore was able to
exactly.
And
do what it did.
was one of the boats for commerce and one for battlement? Is that the other distinction you're making?
Even the Americans were building these and sometimes put guns on them. Chasseur had a few guns, not like a British warship, but had a few guns, mainly for defense. But they weren't going to go pick a fight. What they would do is, if they saw a British ship that was trying to take them, they sailed downwind 5 or 10 miles or something, came about, and sailed back up as close to the wind as they could, leaving the British ship there with its sails hanging down and all these men crawling all over the rigging until, because it can't come about, it has to wear with the wind coming across the stern. Much more awkward, great deal of sail handling, takes a lot of time. By this time, the American ship was out of sight. So if it couldn't carry as much cargo, that was all right. They could outrun.
Okay, let's see what's left here. What is this? Anybody know what this is?
It's a pagoda.
That's in Madison Park.
Latrobe, right?
It was Latrobe's grandson who designed it in the 1890s, and it sits at the top of what was Hampstead Hill. The great thing about this is, if you climb to the top, if it is open on weekends, you can see right down to the harbor. You can see Fells Point. Beyond Fells Point, you can see Fort McHenry. And that's where the British would have come in and fired on this position. So my daughter used to live across the street from this, and I used to love to go up there and look at that view and realize what it meant.
Incidentally, there was a huge American encampment on Hampstead Hill, Patterson Park, during World War I.
There was a big encampment there for the Civil War
Yes, there.
as well, because it's such a big open park. This is a view of Federal Hill from the street below. This street is named Battery Avenue. I lived a block away from there for 14 years. I don't think that's a 42 by 30 foot flat, but it's pretty big. The view from the top is amazing. And that's a cannon from the Civil War. As I said before, there's a whole garrison of Union troops stationed there to keep peace in the city during the Civil War.
So the cannons, besides shooting cannonballs, could shoot that missile thing that you were
No,
describing?
that was a special cannon that the British either invented or they brought over just for the war.
Same idea, but different nozzle.
You got me.
Like
I mean,
a mortar, I think.
These are mortar shot cannons, right?
Well, I'm thinking if it shoots it up in the air, it's like a mortar.
They were big, yeah, they were big. And if you've been to the Inner Harbor, you've probably seen this. The Constellation. They used to think it was the original, but it wasn't. It was a rebuilt one from the 1850s. But it gives you an idea of what the ships looked like, what these ships looked like at the time.
Now, is that a clipper ship?
Are they?
Is that a clipper ship? or-
No,
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 okay.
no, it's not a ship. The Pride of Baltimore is more like a clipper ship. Right?
That's clipper ship.
That's a clipper ship. See, I'm not a sailor, but I knew that much.
Baltimore clipper.
And last but not least, this is the monument of the Battle of North Point. And I've never been there. It's kind of hard to find. So I'm going to pass around one more thing. And these are the places you can go to visit. If you're interested. I highly recommend, if you look at the handout, I highly recommend the website called Baltimore Heritage. I actually put together this in 2012, bicentennial Battle of Baltimore. They got a grant to do an archaeology dig. And they found the ruins of the tavern, which they knew was there, and was like the headquarters of the commander. But they found other things too, cannonballs, musket shells, and so on. To verify the fact that Hampstead Heath was intended to be the main defense, the main site of the battle. But I call it the battle that never took place. The British never got there, for all the reasons that I explained. So I'm pretty much done. Do you have any other questions or comments you want to make?
Wrap up that in the war.
I'm sorry?
After this battle, well, while it's good for the United States, what happened, just run us through, how did the war then end? What happened after that? The actual war ended.
Oh, I didn't mention about the treaty again. The Treaty of Ghent was negotiated in December of 1814. It wasn't signed by the two parties until 1815, February 1815. The Battle of New Orleans, that's what I didn't mention. The Battle of New Orleans was terrible for the British. You know who the American commander was?
Jackson.
Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson. And he rose in popularity after that. He arranged the defense of New Orleans. So after the Battle of Baltimore, Admiral Cochrane and the other British forces gradually found their way south to New Orleans because they knew there was going to be a big battle there. Andrew Jackson fooled them by luring them to attack a fort where he had incredible guns. 2,000 British soldiers were killed charging this fort by the guns that the Americans had there. I don't know all the other details, but that was the last battle, because after that, they got word that the peace treaty had been signed. And that was the end of it. And the terms of the peace treaty make it pretty clear that both sides were sick and tired of the battle. It wasn't needed anymore. The wars were over. So it was kind of a sad end to see 2,000 British troops dying needlessly because the war was already ended.
I also heard that the British pulled out of the war to get back to England because they needed the ships and the men to fight Napoleon.
To fight who?
To fight Napoleon.
Oh, okay. No, that was over. The Napoleonic War was over in 1814. The Battle of Waterloo was in 1814.
15. In 1850, even though this was that was his second defeat.
Second, yeah.
Oh, okay.
At this point, he did not forget the name of the battle in Santa Elba.
Waterloo?
No, the one before, or that was defeated before, and exiled to Elba, then and came back for 100 days and lost at Waterloo, and was exiled to St. Helena.
Right.
So was the unsuccessful Battle of Baltimore the immediate cause why the British negotiated the Treaty of Ghent in December of 18?
Good question. I don't know the answer. I think they were getting tired of the war. And certainly, no, I think the Battle of New Orleans, where they lost 2,000 men. And by then,
How soon after Baltimore was the Battle of New Orleans?
December.
I think you said February.
Hmm?
Well, I don't know.
But that was after the peace period. Yeah. So
After it was negotiated but not ratified by the two governments. That took another month, at least. I mean, that's how slow things happen in those days.
That hasn't changed.
Yes.
There's a part on your outline, publication and distribution of the Star Spangled Banner. Could you talk about that?
Oh, yes, thank you. What Francis Scott Key did, he went to a printer in Baltimore. The next day, after he got out off of that ship, was freed, and had copies, individual copies printed for all the men stationed at Fort McHenry. Then he took it to a newspaper. I'm glad you brought that up. Then he took it to the newspaper who published it in Baltimore, and it spread across the whole East Coast within a matter of weeks. And it became very popular. But guess what it was finally chosen to be the national anthem? 1931.
That's crazy.
But it was very popular in the Civil War, very popular during World War I. For the longest time, the two rival candidates to be the national anthem were Yankee Doodle Dandy and God Bless America.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought that up.
But the music was put to it later, right?
No, it was set to the music of a drinking song.
So Key put it to the music too?
No, he didn't write the music, but he specified what it was to be sung to.
Okay, so he did do that. Oh, yeah, but he did, yeah.
He specified the tune
Yeah.
that was well known to gentlemen who,
Right.
drank. And not only that, what's the problem with singing the national anthem?
It's a question and you never get the answer. It's
Well,
all
there are 4 verses. There are 4 verses. Very few people get all 4 verses, including me. The problem from what I hear from musicians is that the high and the low notes are so far apart. So it was not an easy tune to sing.
Well, except when you were drunk.
Except it was
the only time you can hit that.
Or the low note.
I want to know the original lyrics.
I've seen them somewhere.
Well, thank you for coming.
Was it